In progress.
Say we're starting in a minute, or will you, or it's 8:04.
Is it working? There you go. I've been meaning to call you, like, thank you. It's perfect. You're a lifesaver.
One of the little buttons got a little damage with
That's
the code, but no,
As long as you can sit.
it's easy to the instruction easy, but it's Chinese. It's not lined up properly.
I see.
But you said in it, and
It's very comfortable. Yeah. Thank you. You're a good man. Okay. Howdy, everybody. There are source sheets floating around. There are some on the beam and some up front if you need it. Those of you who are joining us on Zoom land, just wave if you could hear me. Sam, are we getting waves?
There's only one person camera.
Or unmute? Or can you hear us in Zoom land?
There's only
No?
yeah, somebody's waving.
All right, one
Okay.
person waving. Okay.
Excellent.
So those that are joining us via Zoom, you're missing out. We've got, hundreds of people here. It's standing room only, and you should think about joining us next week for part 3, which we'll be talking about Mitzitza B'Peh. Our topic this evening is extremely, extremely complex. It is the topic of brain death, the big debate about how we define death. And what we've been doing from last week, each week, is we've been trying to gain a little bit of perspective into the great life that was the life of Rabbi Tendler. And as we discussed last week, as we kind of started to see the glimpse of his personality, we got a better understanding of Rabbi Tendler's commitment to Torah values, his commitment to medical values, to ethics, and the way that he was able to fuse the two and really become, in a sense, the father of what we would call like a medical halacha, where he was able to take science, we say Torah umada, he was able to really do Torah mada together as one, and to fuse them in a way that very few people have ever been able to do that before. There's more source sheets on the beam if you'd like, for those who are just walking in. So last week we talked about his role. We were curious about swordfish and the fact that he was able to really take something that historically was kosher, and through his beliefs and his science, he ended up creating a culture where no one to this day really eats swordfish. And we've had a lot of really good side conversations about swordfish since. And now we're going to switch topics a little bit. I want to talk about defining death. And historically, until not so long ago, death was actually not particularly difficult to define, either from a legal or a halachic perspective. And why is that? Because only in the more recent modern age have we been able to do things that allow us to protract and to continue living with modern machines and modern medicine. So for instance, if you were living in the 1700s, there were no respirators, there were no iron lungs, there was no oxygen tanks. You just, when your body was in a state that needed those things, unfortunately you died. And so there really wasn't a lot of uncertainty for a very long time. And in fact, if you look in box number 1, in 1951, Black's Law Dictionary, this is the 4th edition, defines death in a very particular way, which again, until the modern age makes sense. Death is a total stoppage of the circulation of the blood, a cessation of the animal and virtual functions consequent thereupon, such as respiration, pulsation, etc. And so secular law didn't consider death to take place really any earlier than Jewish law did. And so this never was a big issue. But something came about in 1968, which is known as the Harvard criteria. And then after that, the President's Commission for the Study of Ethical Problems in Medicine and Biomedical Research. And so if you look in box number 2, this does a good job of explaining some of the evolution, which comes with the better understanding of science. And even when we read this box here in box number 2, I want you to think about how much more we know today than they did back in 1968, and how much better understanding we have. The technology, the brain scans, the waves, the way we can understand a body is just unparalleled. So brain death, understood in the sense of, quote, whole brain death, and not in the sense of brainstem death, we're going to define those ideas shortly, was introduced into clinical practice in 1968 when the Harvard Ad Hoc Committee defined irreversible coma as a new criterion for death, understood in the full sense of the word. According to the Uniform Determination of Death Act, promulgated in 1981 by the President's Commission, which also formally advanced the first conceptual rationale for brain death, the legal declaration of death using the brain death standard requires the irreversible cessation of all functions of the entire brain, including the brain stem. The brain death standard has since evolved, however, to include significant modifications, even though on a literal reading, its clinical test criteria have remained unchanged. And so this creates, as you can imagine, all of a sudden, we have a new category, or new categories, I should say, of death. Up until the 1950s, halacha and ethical and medical perspectives were pretty much in line. But then suddenly we started to evolve that definition based on the Harvard criteria, and we started introducing different ways to define death. Now we've introduced something called brain death or brain stem death. And that is suddenly a different type of death than we're talking about beforehand. So again, I'm not a doctor, I want to be clear. And what I'm hoping for us to do is just to really tiptoe around into some of the sources and get a bit of an understanding for the sugya on the whole, and then kind of go up to 60,000 feet and get a better understanding of where does Rabbi Tendler fit into all of this and what can we learn about him through this process. So let's first start by defining the different types of death that exist. The first is brainstem death, which is the cessation of spontaneous respiration. For our context, we're actually going to define brainstem death and brain death the same. We're gonna really just call that brain death. The second type of death is called a cessation of a heartbeat. Someone's heart stops. That would also be considered death. The third type of death is called full body death. That comes approximately 3 days after breathing stops. And this comes far much later than most legal definitions of death. And then the last two are one, let's call it clinical death. You hear this all the time. Someone died on the table, but they were able to bring them back to life, right? So they died clinically, which is temporary and it's reversible. And then we have another type of death, which is death of the cerebral cortex, which is loss of consciousness. However, the body is still able to function. So this would be what's called a PVS, someone who's in a pervasive vegetative state. I think it's what it stands for. What was it? Persistent vegetative state. Thank you. So that's someone who very sadly is in some type of vegetative state where they are breathing, but they have no activity. They are dead in the cerebral cortex. And so that's another type of death. And so you can imagine that the rabbis, when they were talking about death and halacha and trying to create the sources for us to create the life that we know it, as halacha means a way of life. So these definitions, we have to figure out, did the rabbis consider these definitions or did they just not have as much information? Again, very generally, for those who are not versed in this area, there are really three major life support systems in the body: the brain, respiratory, which is like breathing, and cardiac and circulatory, and that's the heart. And so before our modern times, the only things that we were able to really identify were breathing and heartbeat, and we weren't able to identify someone's brain activity. There were no brain scans. I don't know what scans the brain. I know there's something that scans the brain. We didn't have those things back in those times, but these things have evolved. And in particular, this discussion about defining death, and my apologies for this long introduction, I just want to make sure we're all on the same footing as we delve into the sources. One of the reasons why this became so important and became such a big discussion, because it relates to organ donation. In other words, this is where the ethics and also the halacha really come to the fore. Because when it comes to organ donation, if we can move the time of death to an earlier time, then we can harvest those organs from a body and transplant them and save another person's life. So for instance, if we define death as brain death, in theory, if it can be done, that means that we could actually transplant a heart. Now in 1968, it was actually illegal to transplant hearts because it was such a risky maneuver. Only one person was allowed to continue his research, a man in California, I think it is. And eventually he was able to prove that it was doable. And as we know now, heart transplants do happen. But if a person defines death in a different sense, where it's, for example, when your heart stops beating and your brain stops working, so then you won't have any organs really to be able to potentially donate. And again, I don't want to get too far into organ donation, but this whole idea of organ donation is why this conversation came to the front. And two other reasons why I think this debate continues to rage on and continues to be complicated is number two, limited resources. So with these modern inventions and with these modern tools, we can keep people living for a very long time, and we can keep people on machines for a very long time. And the question becomes triage. Should we keep such a person? Are they really dead? Is this bed, could it be used for somebody else? And that's a reality that sadly, the notion of triaging hospital beds of people who are ill, unfortunately, is something that in the last couple of years, we've had to see firsthand and get a good sense of how difficult that really is. And the last, I think, is quite obviously just sparing family pain. Watching a loved one sitting in a hospital with no function, but unclear, are they alive, are they dead? So this is where all these things have kind of come to the forefront. And so on a halachic level, we have to ask ourselves, time of death is incredibly important, because if you harvest a person's organs before they die, you've killed the person. And murder is a pretty big deal in Jewish law. Like, it's not a small deal, it's like a big deal, right? And so you actually, one of the interesting things about this is that potentially there are some sources who will argue that organ donation is completely usher, it's completely forbidden, because not only are you taking the life of one person by removing their organs, you're also potentially killing another person, because organ donation could be something that's risky, and who knows what might have happened, and maybe their life would have extended, or maybe something would have happened. You've now taken out their organs and put in somebody else's organs. And anyone who's someone who's gone through a transplant knows it does not always go the way that we hope. We pray that everything takes well, but it doesn't always go that way. And so there are some people who would say you can literally be killing two people. So that's twice as bad. What makes this so complicated is not just that it's an evolving situation. What also makes this complicated is that the sources themselves, as we're going to see, are extremely complex and extremely unclear. They're not easy to read. Our scientific information is changing. And then the last two pieces of what makes this such a difficult discussion is that, there are really good opinions on both sides, and they make strong arguments, and you want to believe both of them. And then what has happened with time, and especially when it comes to the halachic piece, is that there's become such an inflammatory culture, and we'll see this in some of the sources, where there is no room for healthy discussion or dialogue or debate in order to really unpack something as complex as this. And so I'm not gonna tell you Lamaisa what we do. I'm not gonna tell you organ donation is good, organ donation is bad, brain death. I don't want to define that as much as I want to look at the sources again and focus on Rabbi Tendler's opinion. I just want to point out one thing. This is something that one of my Rabbeim shared with me, and he and his wife actually disagree about this debate about brain death. And for this reason, only one of them one spouse told the other spouse that should they ever need an organ for a donation, God forbid, do not take it. Because if I wouldn't give an organ, because I don't think that it is halachically appropriate, it would be forbidden for me to take an organ as well. So just so you have a sense of the complexity of this, it's not just like, brain death or cardiac, like it's so much more complicated. Okay, very long introduction, but now I think we're all set and we can jump in. So the very first place we need to look is box number 3, which is the Mishnah in Yoma. This Mishnah is, it's scary to read when you think about what happened just a short while ago in Florida. Mishanaf lalav mapolet. What happens? The Mishnah teaches us in Perek Chet, in the 8th Perek in Yoma, what happens when a mapolet, debris, a building falls down on top of people, and there's a safek husham, safek inusham. There's a suffix where there's an uncertainty. There might have been people in the building, there might not have been people in the building. Safek chai, safek mate. And not only might there have been people or not people in the building, we're also not sure whether the people who were in the building lived or whether they died after the debris came down. Not only that, safek nachri, safek yisrael. We don't even know the people in the building, are they Jewish or they're not Jewish. So you have uncertainty upon uncertainty upon uncertainty. And the question is, what are we allowed to do on Shabbat? So the Mishnah tells us, we are allowed to remove on Shabbat the debris to search for those human remains. And why is that allowed? Because we're allowed to save a life. Even when it comes to a safek pikuach nefesh, we're allowed to desecrate Shabbat to save a life. And so the Mishnah continues, if we find this person to be alive, we can keep working and extricate him. However, the Mishnah tells us if the person is dead, if you get to him and he's dead, you have to stop your work. You cannot pull out the dead body on Shabbat. So we allow you to remove the debris on Shabbat. We allow you to do whatever you can to save this person's life. But once you to be dead, you're not allowed to continue. So what's the obvious question we're going to ask? How do we determine death? The Mishnah just said that you're not allowed to continue if he's dead. Well, how are we going to determine death? So the Gemara wants to know this question. So if you turn over your sources, and those of you in Zoom land, hopefully you're following with us here. The Gemara in Yoma continues and says, Tanu Rabbanan, ad hechan hu bodek. How far must we check a person to identify if the person is living or not? So the Mishnah, the Gemara continues, ad chotmo. Two opinions are given. One opinion is a person needs to remove the debris until we get to their nostrils. Why is that significant until we get to their nostrils? Because it can show us if the person's breathing. The second opinion says ad libo, until a person reaches the heart. Why is that significant? Because if the heart has stopped, then perhaps the person is dead. So the Gemara continues, just because you find people on the top of the rubble who are dead, don't assume that people on the bottom are dead. Because in fact, there are plenty of stories where we know where there could be people who sadly perished on the top of the rubble, but for some miraculous reason under the rubble, they might have survived. So you can't assume anything about a person's situation until we check them out. And the Gemara here is debating, how do we check them out? Do we check them out ad libo, or do we check them out ad chotmo? Do we check them out until their chest, or do we check them out until their nostrils? And the Gemara continues the next two paragraphs. We won't look into them right now, but fascinating for those of you who are interested in the science about what is the potential distinction between these ideas. One opinion is suggesting here in the Gemara that when we are created on a cellular level, the Gemara is talking about, do we come from are we born like heart out, right? Do we come from the inside out or outside in? And so it's interesting science things here. But let's jump to the end over here, which is Amar Rav Papa. Rav Papa wants to define our machlokas, and this is very interesting. Machloket mimata lemala. There's a machlokas when it comes specifically when we are removing the person from the feet towards their head. What does that mean? That means that we find a person's feet and the rest of their body is covered in rubble. So you're working your way from the feet towards the top. The Rav Papa is suggesting that what is the machloket? The machloket is, how far must you go up? Must you continue past the heart to see if there's breathing? Or if you see the heart has stopped, that's enough. And so he says, if you get to the head first, he says, if you get to the head first and a person is not breathing, you can assume that nothing else is working and therefore he is dead. You don't have to continue to check. All in whose nostrils are in the breath of the spirit of life. That's from Breshit. And the idea that the spirit of life comes from one's nostrils. And so when we have to look at this Gemara, we have to ask ourselves, does this Gemara prove that respiration is the ultimate determinant of whether someone is to be alive or dead? Is respiration, the fact that Rav Papa says that if you can just see a person's nostrils, is that enough to determine whether a person is alive or not? Does this recognize heartbeat and respiration as defining death? Is respiration just a sign of cardiac function? And so you can see this Gemara is a little bit unclear, but I think I want to say maybe the simplest reading, would be that this Gemara seems to indicate that respiration is tied to brain activity. A person who is brain dead is not going to have spontaneous respiration, which is the respiration that we're doing right now. Spontaneously, we're just breathing. Such a person will not breathe if they are brain dead. And so if a person is not breathing, so perhaps they really are dead, and that's how we define it from this Gemara. I just want to point out as an aside, and I don't want to get too far into it, this is not the only version of this Gemara. The Yerushalmi brings it. The Rif also has a version of the Gemara, which does not reference the heart at all. It actually only references the navel. It makes no mention of a heartbeat whatsoever. And that's just an interesting piece that only makes this Gemara even more complicated. And if you go back to your first page, you'll notice both the Rambam and the Shulchan Aruch, both of them rule that one is required to continue excavating the debris only until reaching the nose. And it seems to be that breathing itself defines life. And so on the basis of this, many have concluded that heart activity, whether a person has a beating heart or not, is not halachically relevant to defining the time of death. So that's the very first piece of information. Hold that for 1 minute. Now it's, yes, sir.
I don't know the medics. Yeah. Isn't it if your heart beats the breathing, or is that completely from your heartbeat without you breathing?
Yeah.
The
The question is, can your heart continue to beat while you're breathing?
No. If your heart beats, as long as your heart beats, it means you're breathing. So why do you have to check the heart? Unless my assumption is wrong.
Yeah, so no, that's so correct. So my understanding, again, I'm not a scientist or a doctor. My understanding is that when a person is brain dead, they are no longer breathing. However, machines, they're no longer breathing on their own. However, machines can continue breathing for them such that their heart can continue to go on. So for example, a person could be, and again, I want to make a distinction between a person in a vegetative state, that's not brain death like we're talking about. Brain death is where a person's brain is no longer sending signals to tell the heart to pump.
No, I'm not talking about what we know today. I'm talking about the Gemara.
Yeah, it's uncertain is my point. Yeah.
What is the Havamina that if you see that he's not breathing, to go further and check the heart?
So Arya asked, what's the Havamina to go further to check the heart? So that's the point, I think, is that there is no Havamina to go. If a person's not breathing, then he's dead. So he's dead. That's correct. And if he's dead, if you're not breathing, so we have a definition potentially of death, brain death. Person who cannot spontaneously breathe.
So now it's the other way around. Let's say they start from the feet.
Yes.
And they discover the heart is not breathing. Are you still? Then they say you go up to the.
So Rav Papa is, so just Arya is asking for clarification on the Gemara. So that's what Rav Papa is saying. The debate in the beginning part of the Gemara of how far do you go, that debate revolves around exactly this question. Do we believe that it's the heart, or do we believe it's the nose? But in the end, we know if you start from the head, then that's enough. Yeah. So I want to just pocket it here, and we're going to continue to analyze this. The second piece I want to show you is the Mishnah on Olos, taken from Perek Aleph Mishnah Vav. It's box number 7. And again, these are very complicated. I'm trying to go through them as slowly as I can. The Mishnah says as follows: Adam eino metame ad shetetze nafsho. A person does not become tameh. A person does not become ritually impure, meaning correct. That's right. A person does not give off ritual purity, correct, until their nefesh, until their soul leaves them. Vafilu megayed, vafilu goses. Even if he's cut up, even if he's about to die, it doesn't make a difference. So zokik the yibum afoter mina yibum machi b'truma posted b'truma. So similar, he still can make levirate marriage, obligatory exempts from yibum, and he can also feed his mother truma and disqualify a mother from eating truma. Okay, let's get to the end of the Mishnah. V'chein behema v'chaya einan metamin ad shetetze nafsham. The same applies now to animals. Now here's where it gets fascinating. Butzu rashihem. What happens if we chop off an animal's head? Chop off the animal, we decapitate an animal. Afal pi shemifar kisim timeim kegon zanav shel te'ah shehi mifar rekas, mifar kaset. So imagine like a lizard. If you chop off a tail of a lizard, what happens to the tail of a lizard? It continues to move around, right? So the Gemara says here, if you decapitate somebody, the Mishnah says, if you decapitate somebody, you chop off an animal's head. As soon as you chop off the animal's head, what happens? They are considered mitame. They are considered as if they can now go and make things around them impure, which means that they are now dead. The neshama has walked out, has left their body when you chop off their head. And even though you might think that if things are moving and the tail's wagging or whatever it is, even if that's happening, you would think, what do you mean it's not dead? The animal's still moving. It says, no. Even if that happens, it's not considered to be movement that defines things for us in terms of death. Based on this Mishnah Olos, this seems to suggest that physical decapitation is a conclusive indicator of death. And just because you have some subsequent movement doesn't make that death not death, which means, do we say that when a person is brain dead, that they are decapitated? Because if you are brain dead, if your brain is not functioning and your brain is not sending signals to the rest of the part of your body, is it like you are decapitated? There's actually like studies about this. There was a study that was done in more recent times where they decapitated, I think, like a sheep or a lamb, I think that was, and to see if she would still give birth to a baby. I'm not exactly sure that the circumstances. I think it was in regards to Shlomo Zalman Auerbach and his trying to understand this case. But in any case here, what we pick up from this Mishnah Olos is that we have another level of explanation, and we have to figure out, how does this Mishnah fit into the Gemara and Yoma? What about spasms of the body that continue far after this moment? And what about like spasms that are more substantive? So for example, what happens if a person's body continues to operate, but their brain isn't working? For instance, let's say their heart is still moving. If the heart is beating, is that the same thing as a tail wagging after it gets cut off? So the Rambam actually in this Perush HaMishnah, on this Mishnah, seems to suggest that when animation is not being controlled by the brain, then it doesn't count as animation. And so if the heart is continuing to beat because you're connected to some machine that is allowing the heart to continue to beat, so then maybe that heart could be transported somewhere else and it could be transplanted or maybe even donated somewhere else, because perhaps you can say that we define brain death. And so proponents of brain death argue 3 points. One, a dysfunctional brainstem is equivalent to a decapitated one, which we call physiological decapitation. Number two, destruction of brainstem inevitably means inability to spontaneously respirate, which is the Gemara and Yoma. And number three, that subsequent movements, again, there's something called, I think, the Lazarus effect or something, as someone, when they die, a person can still twitch and move their body. And so even then, or even the heartbeat, by the way, might fall into this category of pirchus, which the Mishnah and Olos defines. And since those movements are not coordinated from a central point, because they're not coordinated from a brain, therefore those movements don't count. But if it was coming from the brain, then that would be a problem. So those who want to read brain death as the definition of death, read those Gemaras this way. However, we know if this was as simple as could be, then we wouldn't be here, we wouldn't be talking about this. There are others who read these sources very differently. And the primary point of distinction about this comes from a Rashi back in Yoma, which is box number 8. So let's look at the second Rashi in this over here. The very end, as Rashi is trying to explain our case about a person who is stuck under the rubble, Rashi here says, and he's explaining the two opinions, he says, Demar Amar Belibo Yesh Lahadchinim Yesh Bo Chayot Shnishmato Dofeket Sham. He says, we want to check the heart to see whether there's life coming from it. Umar Amar Ad Chotmo, we have to go up until the nostrils, the Zimnin De'en Chayot Nikar Belibo V'Nikar B'Chotmo. He says, why do we have to go up to the nostrils? It's not, Rashi says, because we define death based on respiration, but we need to go up to the nostrils because there are some situations you just can't hear the heartbeat. You can't get a good pulse. You can't really hear it. The person's trapped under rubble. you can't really know the action. It's hard to see their heartbeat. But a person who is breathing, you put a little feather up or something, you could identify whether a person is breathing, and perhaps that's what they were arguing about. So Rashi actually adds a whole level of complexity to this, because he's basically says from our Gemara, it has nothing to do with defining the moment of death as being brain death, as much as the Gemara here is simply debating that there are different ways that a person could define death. And it's not defining it's not categorically defining how we define death, as much as the Gemara here is simply talking about different ways in which a person could be considered death. And so because of this, and Rashi in the first line over there says that it's Hechanu Bodek im doma lamet she'eno mezias evaro, right? He makes it clear that that these are only when there's no sign of life, right? Because if he's doma lames, right? If he looks like he's he might have life, but the question is whether or not we can apply the criterion of breathing alone when we know that there might actually be a clear heartbeat. And this ties a little bit, Aryeh, to I think what you were talking about before. So that's Rashi's interpretation. And so therefore, this complicates matters. And this creates a second school of thought, which reads all these sources differently. And the second school of thought suggests that we read this Gemara, it doesn't define brain death in any which way. It defines, no, when a person's body stops working, brain death, their heart stops working, when everything stops working, that's what we mean by death, not brain death, not a lack of respiration. That's not what we learned from the Gemara in Yoma. And this mission Olos about chopping off a person's head. So there's many ways to explain it, and decapitation. And the fact is that the heartbeat of a person is very different than chopping off a tail of an animal. And therefore, we don't call brain death as is defined legally in the medical ethics community is not the same as what we would define brain death in a halachic perspective, and therefore they disagree categorically against brain death. So you have these two schools of thought, which I'm oversimplifying, but I'm just trying to give you kind of a foundation, because that takes us like lemaisa. So it shouldn't be a surprise to you. Rabbi Tendler fought tooth and nail for the definition of brain death. That and he defines it exactly as we just said. And you can see all of this. We just don't have time. But if you look in source number 9, this is Rabbi Tendler in the Jewish Review 90. We just saw him, and he explains them much more eloquently than I could, and you can see it all right here. Not only does he define it, he also does us the favor of challenging a few of his friends and colleagues, other Rosh Yeshiva at Yeshiva University, and other great rabbis. In particular, his good friend, Rabbi J. David Bleich, you can see in the third paragraph, who disagrees vehemently. He wrote his own article in the Jewish Review, and also wrote many other articles arguing against Rabbi Tendler. Rabbi Tendler, just to give some history, created what was known as like the healthcare proxy form that the RCA adopted. And this is the healthcare proxy that a person would sign, which would allow them to do organ donation in halacha. Now, in more recent time, after that was written by the RCA, the Rabbinical Council of America, and their Vad HaHalacha, I think it's what it's called, which was put together by a bunch of great rabbis, wrote that a very, very lengthy article that summarized all the sources and disagrees slightly with this approach. And just so you have a sense of where like some people fall out on this, so you have the Israel chief rabbinate in Israel holds that organ donation is allowed. There is a lot of there are rabbis here like Rav Schachter and Rav Willig, who I believe, I don't want to speak for them, but I think that they do not hold by brain death. Rabbi Tendler did hold by brain death. And part of what makes this even more complicated is not just a lack of understanding of the primary sources. What makes this in many ways 10 times more complicated is the fact that one of, if not the greatest rabbi of the generation, Rabbi Moshe Feinstein's own opinions, which were written down, by the way, in Shuvos, are not clear, or seemingly not clear. So let me show you a few of them. If you turn the page, you look on page, the next page, box 10. I translated them. I didn't translate them. I brought them translated. I'm sorry. I didn't do that. because I think it would be easier to read it than to try to read it in the Hebrew. So this is one tshuva that was written in 1976. So let's read this this paragraph here, the second paragraph, real quickly, beginning really from the line where it says halachically. Halachically, breathing of this kind is not regarded. Sorry, the preceding discussion refers to a terminally ill patient who is not on a ventilator. Some people, however, do require of a ventilator, and the ventilator inflates the lungs even though the patient is actually dead. Halachically, breathing of this kind is not regarded as a sign of life. The breath of life test requires that the patient breathe on his own. Breathing by means of a machine does not satisfy the halachic definition of respiration, and therefore the patient is considered to be dead so long as the other criteria are met. And what he's going to continue to talk about, which just goes to show you how much things change, he says, well, what do you do then to make sure the person is really dead, that he's not respirating? What do you do? So you just take him off the oxygen. When the oxygen tank is done, you have like a 15-minute window, he says. You take the person off the oxygen and you just quickly check to see if they're breathing. If there's no breathing, don't put a new oxygen tank in. But if the person is breathing, then you just put in another oxygen tank and you keep supporting the person's life. What's the problem nowadays? How does oxygen works in the hospital? It comes from the wall. It comes from a machine. It doesn't come, it's constant. It doesn't come from an oxygen tank anymore. So that's a big problem, because Moshe's suggestion is simply don't, you can't take someone off the oxygen, but when the oxygen runs out, so that's fine. And then he introduces this idea here in the second to last paragraph of a nuclide scan, which determines whether there's any connection between the brain and the rest of the body. The nuclide scan itself is complex because we're not allowed to get close to anybody who's a ghost. Anybody who is near death, we're not allowed to be anywhere near them, lest we come in close contact when they do die. And so this nuclide scan allows us to scan for brain activity. And by doing that, we can figure out if a person is brain dead or not. And this seems to imply very simply that Moshe Feinstein says what? That he holds that brain death is the definition of death, which again opens up all types of possibilities like organ donation. I underlined here because you see this throughout the Chuvos, and this is the focus of our shir, is that he says, moreover, as I've been informed by my son-in-law, that barbiturate, thank you, poisoning can mimic death. So what do you see just from this tshuva alone? Who is his medical advisor? It's none other than his son-in-law, who has his own stake in the game. And he has his own particular perspective of the sources. Now advising probably the most important posek of the generation. And so people challenged Rabbi Moshe Feinstein's ruling, not because they disagreed with him, even though some people did challenge on those grounds. They challenged him because he actually ruled elsewhere in different ways. So take a look in box number 11. I want you to skip the first paragraph for a moment and just start from paragraph 2. He talks about how his physical health is declining, so he couldn't respond. And he says as follows in the second to last paragraph. The information on which my decision was based was provided to me by my son-in-law, Rabbi Moshe Tendler, Shlita, who reviewed the medical journals to date and concluded that there's no basis for assuming that the recipient's condition would be improved by a transplant. All the evidence indicates that no transplant recipient survives for even a few years, and those who survive for less than a year suffer months of intense pain and anguish. And so therefore, he's going to argue that these transplants should not be allowed. And so some say, wait a second, 2 years later, in 1978, Rabbi Tendler is writing a second, not Rabbi Tendler, Rabbi Moshe is writing a second tshuva in Choshen Mishpat about heart transplants. And he talks about how heart transplants shouldn't work. You shouldn't be allowed to do it. And if you can't do a heart transplant, why can't you do a heart transplant like we just said? Because that means that you don't consider physiological decapitation, brain death, as being the definition of death. Because once a person can define and accept brain death as the definition of death, then we consider all of the movements of the heart to be no different than the wagging of the tail of a lizard when it gets chopped off. But if you say that it can't be done, it must be that you don't hold of brain death. So some people say, no, Rav Moshe's opinion changed with time. So Rabbi Tendler says, no, you have it all wrong. Rabbi Tendler, in fact, translated this tshuva. This is his translation. If you look on the top of the first paragraph, this is his own annotation. He says, you don't understand. My father-in-law, Rabbi Moshe Feinstein, he said that you're not allowed to do a heart transplant. Why can't you do a heart transplant? Because this was someone who was in a vegetative state. This was a person who has cerebral death. This is not a person who has brainstem death. This is why he made the tshuva this way. And so what's happening here in the tshuvot of Rav Moshe Feinstein is a debate about what Rav Moshe even held or didn't hold. For instance, if you flip over the page, you'll notice there is an article, a letter on the bottom, which is written to the Honorable Herbert J. Miller, Chairman, Assembly, the Committee on Health. New York State was trying to establish what do we define as death. This is significant because if once you're dead in the hospital, what do they do with you? They usher you out. Now, if the definition of death is different in a hospital than it's different in Jewish law, we have a problem. So he writes a letter and he says, this bill that you've written is, as written is and has always been unacceptable. So this seems to contradict everything that he just said. So how could it be that Moshe Feinstein in one breath, in one tshuva, no pun intended about the breath, how could it be that in one tshuva, Moshe Feinstein says that it's good, and other tshuvas, he seems to be letting on that maybe brain death is not the definition of death? And unsurprisingly, his son-in-law, Rabbi Tendler, responds to this again and disagrees and says that that was never the case. Rabbi Tendler writes, and you can see this back in box 13 in the Jewish Review. Just read the first few sentences here. That with regard to my father-in-law, Rabbi Moshe Feinstein, we must remember the important fact that all of Rabbi Feinstein's early tshuvas in this area were on cerebral death. He had only one tshuva on brain death, and Rabbi Feinstein, contrary to what some would have you believe, never changed his mind on the subject. He simply made a separate tshuva with respect to a new set of medical facts. And I should parenthetically relate that 2.5 weeks prior to Rabbi Feinstein's death, he turned to me and said, I know I'm close to death, but I want you to know that I'm proud, even boastful, that I've never, ever had to withdraw a response that I wrote. I never had to change my mind. So what we have here is a person in Rabbi Tendler who's giving insight and who's giving ideas as to what his father-in-law, or Moshe Feinstein, believed and didn't believe. And yet he himself, Rabbi Tendler, is a big part of the debate. And again, I can show you, I have literally a folder full of articles. There are books written and so much ink has been spilled by Rabbi Tendler and by others trying to tease out this debate and trying to, in very inflammatory ways sometimes, challenge each other's opinions. And what makes it so complicated is that Rav Moshe Feinstein actually ruled about this stuff. And these tshuvas are maybe unclear, maybe not so unclear. So for example, if you look in box number 12, in 1985, this is the new tshuva, which is determining death. And you can read this at your leisure, where he seems to make it very clear that he is defining death as brain death, which made things complicated. So how did he explain away, or how does Rabbi Tendler explain this letter that went to New York State? So if you flip it over to this page over here that talks about the anatomy of a tshuva, you can read it, where he explains more in depth what Rabbi Moshe Feinstein really believed and how he was concerned that even though he believed in brain death, he didn't want to limit the rights of other Jewish people who felt differently. And maybe that's why he wrote that letter. That letter is not indicative of what he really believed or what he didn't believe. This is just complicated, is the bottom line. It's very, very complicated. And chief among the complications, if you just go to the last page here, because we're running short on time, is that all the tshuvos that I shared with you come from a book, this book, Responsive of Moshe Feinstein. Who wrote the book? Who edited the book? Rabbi Moshe Tendler. He translated all those tshuvos. Now, chas v'shalom, I'm not suggesting that Rabbi Tendler's translations were not accurate translations, but I can tell you that I've read the tshuvos, and there's more ambiguity in the writing than Rabbi Tendler gives off in some of his translations. This creates even more confusion around the topic, and I want to put the topic on the side and say we can have an entire series just on brain death and different opinions about whether we accept brain death as the definition of death. But I want to spend just the last few minutes just talking about Rabbi Tendler's life itself, because Rabbi Tendler spent so much time with Rabbi Moshe Feinstein in a way that no one else did. He was Rabbi Moshe Feinstein's go-to medical expert, but he wasn't just his medical expert. Rabbi Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, for example, had medical experts. Rabbi Tendler accused those medical experts in actually misleading Rabbi Shlomo Zalman Auerbach. You can see that in this long photocopied page where he makes that accusation. What makes it more complicated about Rabbi Tendler is that he was also a Rosh Yeshiva. He was also an extremely learned person with his own opinions of the sources. So how much of Rabbi Tendler's own interpretation of what the Mishnah Olos meant colored the way that he shared information with Rabbi Moshe Feinstein? On the other hand, Rabbi Tendler was a great man. Far be it for us to even suggest that he would color the way Rabbi Feinstein saw any of these issues. And this is a person in Rabbi Tendler who had unparalleled access. So perhaps we can suggest that this is a man who really knew the greatest, like I said, one of the greatest rabbis of our generation more intimately than anybody. If you look here in this last box I put here, box 16, you can see how he so clearly articulates exactly what his father-in-law believed. The opinions I publicized in the name of Moshe were not inferred from his writings, but are direct quotations of his statements to me and from what he actually decided in the many cases presented to him. If you believe Rabbi Tendler, if you believe what he's saying, then you should believe that Rabbi Moshe Feinstein felt this way. And yet, many people disagree and said, no, Rabbi Tendler, you don't know your father-in-law as well as you think that you did. And this is just adding complexity to this incredible person and this incredible life. And so I want to stop here. We'll pick up next week. We spent our first week last week talking about the role that Rabbi Tendler had in creating a cultural moment of halacha for the Jewish people in Swordfish. Today, hopefully, you got a small indication of the role that he played on a halachic level with one of the greatest minds and leaders of our time. And next week, we're going to see a little bit about how Rabbi Tendler dealt with other segments of the community in the issue of Metzitza B'Peh. So we'll stop here, and I'm happy to take questions on Rabbi Tendler or on the topics. Yes, sir.
Does the RCA have an opinion, an official opinion?
I believe the RCA still, I believe, I don't know exactly, I probably should, but the RCA still has the healthcare proxy, does still have the healthcare proxy, yes. So I believe that it does not. There's two options now. Yeah, so there could be, yeah. So I'm not exactly sure myself. There's like literally like a 50 or 60 page tshuva that's written by 7 rabbis. I would say that it seems to me that the vast majority of opinions, of rabbinic opinions, seem to suggest that brain death is not how we define death. But I will also say that the chief rabbinate in Israel does define it that way. And if a person does not define brain death as death, then it really limits the scope of organ donation. Some organs could be donated, for example, like kidneys potentially, because you can do that while you're living, maybe even liver potentially, but to donate other parts of a person's body becomes more complex. And I'll just say what I said from the very beginning, which is like, again, I have a rabbi, a teacher, a Rosh Yeshiva, who feels very strongly that he and his wife, that one of them in their relationship, because they feel that this is the case, they've told the other spouse that if God forbid something happens, do not accept an organ from me, because I wouldn't donate an organ. If I wouldn't donate an organ, I certainly wouldn't take an organ, which is like an incredible thing to suggest. Other questions, comments, or concerns? Okay, anything from the Zoom land? Feel free to send questions there. Okay, we'll stop here in the meantime. You're welcome to stick around for a few minutes. We're back next week with Metzitza B'Peh. Again, there's a lot to unpack. I encourage you to read through these tshuvas yourself, develop your own opinions. And then I also included here the Chasim Sofer, which also can be read in two different ways and is probably also one of the more important sources in trying to understand the issue itself. So feel free to continue the learning and try to understand. Oh, yeah.
Did Rav Shlomo Zalman feel that Rav Moshe was being mispresented by Rav Tendler?
So Rav Shlomo Zalman, Rav Shlomo Zalman's opinion is a matter of debate itself. It seems to be that he changed his opinion with time. That's what it seems to be. Some people believe that he never changed his opinion. He always felt one way about it. And you literally, if you Google it tonight, you will find that many people will read it in different ways. Rabbi Tendler believes, I'll read it to you, the line here, Hagon Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach was clearly stated his full concurrence with the brainstem death definition of halachic death, was quoted both by Dr. Abraham and the Aguda as in opposition. This misrepresentation seriously calls into question the validity of other statements made by Dr. Abraham and the Aguda in the name of the Gaon. To facilitate the understanding of these documents, I'd like to point out the critical errors on the part of those who objected to Rav Feinstein's ruling on brain death. And so even Rav Shlomo Zalman's opinion is complex. I want to just clarify something. I don't want anyone to walk away thinking that I'm suggesting that Rabbi Tendler is misinterpreting Rabbi Feinstein's rulings. I'm simply pointing out that he had unparalleled access to Rabbi Feinstein, and either we should believe what he says because he was there, and we should therefore have clarity about what Rav Moshe said, or we have to ask ourselves, why do we not believe what Rabbi Moshe Tendler says? And primarily, it's the Aguda and others who have challenged Rabbi Tendler's opinion. And again, you can find some of this debate in, like, I think 1990 or 1980 something in the Jewish Observer. There's a big debate. They gave space to Rabbi Tendler to write his opinion, and then another rabbi challenged, and then the newspaper said, after this last article, that will end the debate. And that was the end of the debate in the newspaper. It continues to this day, and it's complex to say the least. Okay, well, continue next week at same time, same place. Think about joining us in person, Mitzvitza B'Peh. Kind of a very interesting topic, I think, relatively speaking. All right, we'll stop here. Have a wonderful evening.
Thank you.